Hello once again. Today we are in the living room because Mom's out of the house for a couple of hours. And there's our lovely Christmas tree that we built. Today I have to show you not really a vintage computer, but an old computer. And one that's pretty cool because I built it completely from scratch. This is the first computer. How many years have I been doing this? This is the first computer that I completely built myself out of the individual components. You guys may remember 3 years ago, 2015, I got, as part of a vintage computer parts haul, an Asus Pentium 4 motherboard, socket 478 motherboard. And some weeks or months after that, I made another video testing the motherboard. I just had the motherboard set up on the floor with a power supply and a random heatsink just sitting on top of the CPU, which didn't end up working very well. And we found that the motherboard worked just fine. Between the first video and that video, my friend Brandon gave me this case that he wasn't using anymore, just bare empty case to put the motherboard in, and eventually, was my plan, build a whole working computer out of it. Well, this case and the motherboard sat in my closet for almost 3 years, about 3 years actually. And just a couple of days ago, I finally finished it. This is a fully working computer now. I've completed it. I had to buy a couple of parts to make it complete so it could run. And yeah, it's a fully working, running computer. And so in today's video, I'm going to show you what I used to build this thing, and we're going to demonstrate it. So I'll start on the outside and then we'll move to the inside in a few moments. But this case that my friend Brandon gave me, it's an A-open case. Oddly, the little, see if I can turn my light off, make that look a little bit better. Oddly, this label on it says ALC open. I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, but it's an A-open case from 2001. It's got a manufacture date of 2001 on it. And there's a sticker on the back of the computer that this case originally housed. It was an Athlon 1000 machine in its original life. And obviously once that became obsolete, Brandon or his dad or someone gutted it, and Brandon gave the case to me. That's pretty sweet. As for the front panel drives that I have in this thing, we have a DVD-RW drive and 2 tape drives which are not hooked up. I only put these here because the gaps were here and I needed something to fill in the gaps. I didn't want these big holes in the case. And, you know, obviously I had no covers to fill in the holes. I hate that computer case covers for the external 3.5 and 5.25 inch bays. I hate that that's not standardized. There ought to be standardized covers that you can just snap in to cover unused bays. But every case is different, and so once a bay has been punched out, you know, unless you have the original cover, or in some cases not even the original cover will go back in, but covers that came out of other cases, they're definitely not going to fit back in, so that really sucks. So I put these 2 bays in, these 2 tape drives in here just to fill the holes. On top is an HP SureStore DAT8 drive. This is the drive that my late friend Neil gave me that I tested to work just fine and then accidentally broke it. I accidentally sheared a ribbon cable off the drive while putting the case back on. The ribbon cable snagged on a hook on the case and sheared right off the circuit board. It's a really small cable. I've been wanting, you know, because the drive worked perfect before then. I know that if I can get that cable reattached, it'll work once again, but the cable is so tiny and in such a it's in an inaccessible place unless I completely disassemble the drive, take the tape mechanism out and get the circuit board out, and I don't know if I'm up to the task for doing that. I looked at it once a few months ago and I was like, I just don't know if I'll be able to do this without completely destroying the drive. I guess I have nothing to lose. If I tear apart the drive, I got nothing to lose if I break it or can't get it back together because it's already non-operational. But yeah, that's in the top bay here. And then in the bottom bay is this HP Colorado 5GB Trevan drive that I got some 8 or 9 or 10 years ago. I forget where. I think maybe my high school math teacher gave this to me, but I honestly don't remember. But it's a Trevan tape drive. I have a couple of Trevan tapes, but they're not the right type for this thing. Down below here, we've got a floppy drive, of course, and a card reader. This is the card reader that came out of the HP Pavilion A720N. You may remember that computer I had for a while. Never really used it, just wasn't a very interesting computer to me. The power supply blew up on it eventually. And my friend Brandon messaged me once and said, hey, I need an ATX computer case to build a computer for my nephew. And I said, hey, I've got this HP computer. It's a standard ATX case. And he said, great, I'll take it. So I pulled out of all the useful parts out of it and then gave that to him. And this is one of the parts that came out of that computer. This is hooked up, but it's not working right. I have a good guess why, and I'll tell you that when we look inside the computer. So that's what's on the front here. Let me turn this around and we'll take a look at the back. Looking at the back of the computer, starting with the power supply. Alright, if I didn't make this clear already, this computer is a total Frankenstein. Like, when I say I built this thing from scratch, I really built it from the most random components that I could fit in here. You can see this is obviously not an ATX power supply. This is the power supply out of an IBM ThinkCenter. You may remember when I got the IBM NetVista, I got a ThinkCenter with it, but it had bad caps on the motherboard and was not functional. So I pulled the parts from that and tossed it. One of those parts was this power supply, which works just fine. It's able to bolt in with 2 screws, and I cut a piece of metal off here so the socket would, so a cord could fit in the socket. And it works just fine. So yeah, we have an IBM ThinkCenter power supply just sort of in here with these gaps on the sides, but it works. No backplate for the motherboard. I do want to get one at some point. I've learned that apparently, at least partially, motherboard backplanes are standardized, so there might be like a standard I/O shield that might fit over this. But for the I/O, we've got PS2 coaxial audio, we've got parallel and serial, 4 USB ports, and gigabit Ethernet. This motherboard's from 2004, and it does have gigabit Ethernet. That's quite impressive. And your standard analog audio. The serial knockouts were punched out of this case. Maybe the original motherboard had the parallel port here and the serial port here. And then I have an AGP video card installed. More on that when we go inside the computer. And then I've got all these ugly open blanks because I have blanks, but they're in my storage unit in Fredericton. So I hate when there's open holes, a case like this. I have one blank here that I was able to put in, but I think the rest of them are in my storage unit. I would stick a bunch of modems in here because those would fill the gaps. But likewise, my modems are in my box of expansion cards, which is also in my storage unit. Oops. I went to my storage unit a couple months ago, well, about a month ago actually, and it was so freezing cold, and for some stupid reason, I didn't have a winter jacket with me to put on. The wind was blowing, the wind chill was like minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was so darn cold. I went to the storage unit with the intention of getting my box of expansion cards and some other things. It was so cold, my hands were numb, and I gave up. I was gonna freeze to death if I stayed in there, so. Oh well, maybe next time I'll get that stuff. Now, I've got the screws off the cover already. Can I take it off without turning the camera off? Yes, I can. Sweet. There's the data manufacturer on the case, 2001, January 27th. Now let's take a look inside here. Things get a bit Frankenstein-y on the inside of this thing too, but it works, so I'm totally fine with that. I think it's hilarious. So there's the motherboard that started it all. It's an Asus P4P800SE socket 478 motherboard made in 2004. And it came with a 2.4 gigahertz Pentium 4 installed. I don't know if it's a Northwood or a Prescott. I have no clue. Maybe when we turn this thing on later, I'll install CPU Z so we can find out. But it's got a 2.4 gigahertz non-hyper-threading Pentium 4. But just last night, I did some looking on eBay, and you can buy a 3.2 gigahertz hyper-threading Prescott for like $5 on eBay. So I bought one. So I have a 3.2 gigahertz hyper-threading Prescott Pentium 4 coming. So I'll be pretty excited to get that and put it in this machine. I should mention, some people who have been watching the channel for a long time actually remember, I've gotten, when I posted a picture of this on my Facebook page, The Maritime Girl, I got a comment from someone saying, hey, wasn't a computer like this your dream machine like 10 years ago? And yeah, that's true. 10 years ago, when my only computer was a 450 megahertz AMD K62 machine, I really, really wanted to buy the parts to build my own Pentium 4 machine. Because at that time, you know, late 2000s, Pentium 4 stuff was starting to get cheap because it was aging. But to me, having a 450 megahertz K62 machine as my only computer, a Pentium 4 to me seemed like an infinite amount of power. So I really, there was like a couple of year span where I really wanted to buy the parts to build my own Pentium 4 machine just like this. But that never materialized for money and other reasons. And of course, once Dad died, I got the Dell Inspiron 1525, which is a Core 2 Duo machine. So that sort of solved that problem. But 10 years later, I finally have my childhood dream computer, and that's pretty darn cool. The primary reason this computer was in a closet for a couple of years was because I didn't have a cooler. I finally bought a cooler on eBay. This is a standard Intel Socket 478 cooler. These are not well-loved coolers. They're noisy and they don't cool that great. But this one was cheap and it works and it fits the mount on the motherboard. See, I've never dealt with, like, the vast bulk of my computer knowledge is Socket 3 and Socket 7 stuff. And a little bit of Socket 370, but once you get past that, I have no idea what I'm doing inside a computer, especially when it comes to coolers, because I know that there's, you know, with Socket 3.7 and 370, the cooler mounts are all the same. But once you get into like the Pentium 4 and later stuff, you'll find computers that have different mounts for the cooling assembly. And not only do you need the cooling assembly, you need the mount for the cooling assembly that installs on the motherboard. Luckily, I got this motherboard, at least if I remember right, I got this motherboard with the mount installed, which is good. And it's a standard Socket 478 mount, totally stock mount for the stock cooler. I wasn't sure, I had no idea, you know, if it was something proprietary or not, so I posted a picture of the motherboard and the mount on a computer group on Facebook, and people said, yeah, that's just a standard Socket 478 cooler mount. So I'm like, great. So I found a standard mount and or a standard cooler, and it fits. It was really hard to install. I was genuinely worried that I would destroy either the mount or the CPU trying to get this cooler installed. There is so much, you need to put so much force on some of the parts to get this cooler installed. It's gonna really suck when that CPU comes and I can update it. So I'm gonna have to remove this and then reinstall it again and hope I don't break anything. But yeah, I bought this cooler. It was like $8 on eBay shipped, and it does the job. Maybe when that 3.2 gigahertz CPU comes, I'll find that it's not adequate anymore, and I'll have to buy an upgraded cooler, one from a third-party company. Other parts I had to get, because this power supply came out of an IBM ThinkCenter, a small form factor ThinkCenter, the cables, the main ATX plug and the 4-pin auxiliary plug that Pentium 4 motherboards usually use, they weren't long enough to reach, so I had to buy an extension for that. And I had to buy an extension for the 20-pin connector, which is right there. And I didn't know the extension I bought was actually 24-pin, or maybe I did know and I knew I could work with it. but I was able to work with it, and you can see, if I zoom in here, you can see the 4 unused pins. I just jammed the 20-pin connector in there, and in order to get the other end of the extension cable to fit on the motherboard, I had to take a rotary tool with a cutting wheel and just cut the extra 4 pins off there. And now the, as you can see, the latch isn't lined up. There's my hair, which is pretty common these days. And I just sort of jammed the remainder of the connector in the motherboard, and it's held on there with friction. So once again, it's really ugly, but it works just fine, so I'm not worried about it. As for RAM, this takes DDR RAM. In fact, I think this is my only desktop computer that takes DDR RAM, which is kind of interesting. So I installed all the DDR RAM I have, which is 1.5 gigabytes. So this has 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. And for the hard drive, I have my remaining 40 gigabyte Maxtor Diamond Max Slimline hard drive. I have 3 of these hard drives in service. One is in my iMac, the other is in the IBM NetVista, and now the third one is in this computer. And people, for the most part, really hate these drives. They're known for being very unreliable, but I have 3 of these all in service, and they've never given me any problems. And the first one I have, I've had it for 15 years almost. My first one of these that I got came in my first, my first modern computer in Christmas 2004, the first custom-built computer, my AMD Sempron machine, which eventually became my mother's computer, which is why I was stuck with the Compaq Presario 5360. For the most part, I was allowed to use the custom-built machine for, internet and video editing and stuff. But yeah, I got my first one of these drives in that computer, and 15 years later, it's still working just fine. I think that's the one that's in the iMac now. And then the other 2 of these I got from other places. I genuinely forget where. But yeah, I have 3 of these in service, and they've all worked perfectly fine. So I really like these drives. They're fast. They're very fast drives for their age. And they're very quiet. They have fluid bearings, very quiet drives. And also, having this been the first hard drive in my first modern computer, is sort of nostalgic to me. The sound of the drive, the sounds it makes when it's seeking, that's very nostalgic to me. So it was a no-brainer choice to use this drive in a computer that is very much similar to that computer that I had 15 years ago that eventually died of a power supply failure. So yeah, I'm sort of considering this. I had 2 of what I called at the time the custom-built computers. The first one, which was an AMD Sempron, and then the second one, which was an AMD Athlon machine that Mum and I jointly bought after the first one died of a power supply failure. And now, so many years later, this computer's come along, and the hardware is of the same era. So this is almost sort of a third custom-built computer. So it's sort of a throwback for me, which is pretty neat. But yeah, that's the hard drive I'm using, 40 gigabyte IDE. This motherboard does have SATA on it. And I have a 40 gigabyte SATA hard drive, but that's also in the storage unit, I think. There's the floppy drive, the 2 tape drives, and the DVD-RW drive, which is also IDE. The chipset this board uses, it's the Intel 865 chipset, if I remember right. Very common socket 478 chipset. And of course, what's really cool about this motherboard, it is fully overclockable. Right in the BIOS, there are options for overclocking. So this was a motherboard sold for the PC enthusiast market. So it's a fully overclockable motherboard. So that I think is pretty cool. And I'll definitely be testing the overclocking, see how far I can push things to improve the performance of this. As for the expansion slot, some of the very last socket 478 motherboards, or not necessarily the very last, but the very best, had PCI Express. This one doesn't. It has AGP, which is fine, and 5 PCI slots, so a lot of expandability here. No onboard video, so I've installed a video card in the AGP slot. Now, the video card I plan to put in this is unfortunately in my expansion card box in the storage unit. So I put in this other card that I have. It's an NVIDIA GeForce 3 Ti 200. I use this video card in the Dell Optiplex GX150, my Pentium 3 Windows 98 machine, but I stole it out of that to so I could play around with this. Now, I've made a sort of a funny modification to this video card. You might see what appears to be, and it is, part of a zip tie poking out through a couple of holes here. And if you look on the business end of the video card, I put my own custom cooler on this. The cooler that came on this video card it was absolute garbage. It was a very tiny heatsink that didn't even feel like metal. It felt like chrome-plated plastic. But a very tiny heatsink and a very tiny fan that was extremely noisy and rattly, and it just sucked. So I pulled that cooler off, and what I took was, this is the heatsink off my mother's old computer, the Packard Bell 7955C, which is a computer that is long gone as of several years ago. But this is the heatsink off that, socket 370 heatsink. And this fan, oh, this is a fan I bought off, this is what was formerly the CPU fan in my socket 7 machine, which I didn't need anymore because the socket 7 machine has a Pentium in it now, with its own onboard cooler, or built-in cooler rather. So yeah, that's my socket 7 CPU fan and a socket 370 heatsink, and I just zip tied it to the GPU chip. And it holds just fine. It's very tight. You can't even wiggle it or anything. I used toothpaste as thermal paste, and that's working just fine. And of course, between I tried to see if I could get by without using a fan with just the heatsink, because I thought maybe because the heatsink's so big that they would be all it needed. But no, that didn't work out. The heatsink got quite warm. So I put the fan on it. But I only have it hooked up to 5 volts, and it keeps it plenty cool. It doesn't get even lukewarm. It stays perfectly cool while it's running, playing games, everything. So that's working great. You might be able to see I'm working with the camera upside down here, so bear with me. I soldered the fan directly to some open 5 volt and ground points on the video card. I just took a multimeter, poked around until I found a 5 volt point and a ground point, and just soldered the fan to that, and it works just fine. Yeah, that was my solution for this video card, and now it's nearly silent, and it runs perfectly cool, so that's great. Oh right, about the memory card bay that I put in the front here. I was able to find this in the storage unit, but I completely forgot to get the internal USB cable that it needs to connect to the motherboard. So what I did was, what I tried, and I think this might be the problem, it's not working, is I used an optical drive audio cable. This is the cable that normally connects your optical drive to the motherboard so you can get compact disc digital audio out through the sound ports. I just used one of these audio cables to connect the internal USB port to the card reader, and that's not working. I'm getting power, and you know, the polarity's correct and everything. When I plug my USB analyzer into the USB port, I'm getting power, 5 volts, but when I plug a flash drive into it, Windows says, I have Windows XP installed on this, Windows says USB device not recognized. If I plug it in a USB port on the back, it works just fine. So I'm thinking a CD audio cable is not working very well as a USB cable. Of course, a USB cable probably has like proper shielding and maybe twisted pairs and stuff to you know, keep the signal clear of interference. This cable probably doesn't have any of that, so perhaps it's just not able to carry the signal adequately, and that's why, you know, power's going through just fine, but when you try to do data through it, it just completely chokes. So that's too bad. I'll either have to And I've looked here, I don't have any other internal USB cables here. I'll have to either buy one or go back into my storage unit and see if I can find the one that originally came with this card reader. Actually, what I can do is, at least just to test it, the Acer Aspire E380 has a card reader that uses the same type of cable. I can pull the cable out of that and use it in this to at least make sure that the onboard USB port and the card reader are working properly. Not that it matters, I mean, I'll probably never use the card reader part, but the front USB port would be kind of nice because this case has no front I/O on it. So having the card reader for the USB port alone is quite useful. Moving along, of course, because this is a Pentium 4, you need all the airflow you can get. So I took advantage of the front case fan grill that's built into the case and installed this case fan and have it blowing inwards. And this case came with a speaker already installed in it, so the motherboard itself has no onboard beeper for PC speaker beeps. So I just plugged, but it does have a header on the motherboard to plug in a speaker. So I have this speaker connected to that header. But in the case of both this fan and this speaker, the speaker had no wires on it at all. It was just a bare speaker. And the fan didn't have the proper connector on it. It was just bare wires. And I didn't have the right connector to put on the speaker. So what I did was, I did what any good handy person would do. I just directly soldered the wires onto the headers. There's the fan wires, which aren't as close to touching as it may appear. But there's the fan wires just soldered onto one of the case fan headers. Then there's the speaker soldered right onto the speaker connector. And once again, it looks ugly, but it works just fine, so I'm totally happy with it. And you know what's funny? I took a picture of this work and posted it on a vintage computer page on Facebook I'm on. I figured I'd get some chuckles out of people, or maybe some people, praising me for my handiwork. But I got the exact opposite. I triggered a bunch of people and got some really angry comments. People telling me, "Oh my God, why would you do that? Oh, this is horrible," and stuff like that. People were really mad at me for having done this. And it blows me away, because who the heck cares? I mean, it works. This is a ratty old Pentium 4 machine, the least desirable generation of computing that you can get. And people were actually angry at me for having done this. They said people called me lazy and said that this was just horrible. And I'm just blown away, because in my opinion, if it works, who cares? And if you don't like it, just don't do it on your own computer. This is my computer. I'll do whatever the heck I want to it. So yeah, it just blew me away. I had one person who said, who agreed with me and said if it works, then fine. But everyone else, I got like 15, 20 comments on that. People just angry at me for having done this. It really blew me away. It's certainly not what I expected, but what can you do? You can't please everybody all the time. Similarly, because this is a power supply that came out of a small form factor computer, and I told you how the auxiliary power and the ATX power I had to buy extensions for to reach the motherboard, this power supply also lacked the peripheral connections that I needed, the Molex and other connectors. This power supply originally had 2 SATA power and 2 Molex power connections. The Molex power connections were not spaced far enough apart that I could plug in the hard drive and the CD drive, and there was no floppy power connector on it. So what I did was, when I scrapped the original power supply from the IBM IntelliStation that died, I cut the whole wiring harness off it, which is what I always do with a dead power supply, because I reuse the wiring. But what I did in this case was I actually reused the whole harness. I cut one of the SATA power connectors off this power supply, and I soldered on the harness from the IBM IntelliStation power supply. So I now have like 3 extra Molex connectors and a floppy power connector. And funny enough, I posted a picture of this prior on that Facebook page, and people praised me for this work, said it was very handy, a good way to reuse a power supply that might not have all the connections you need. So yeah, I was praised for that, and then I was berated for this, so whatever. But yeah, I used some nice heat shrink tubing, so it looks a bit better than the work I did for the IntelliStation, where I just used electrical tape because I didn't have heat shrink tubing with me at the time. So yeah, I added some more connectors onto the power supply, and when you do something like this, you of course want to be mindful that you're not doing this because you're going to plug so much stuff in the power supply that you might overload it. This power supply is 225 watts. That's kind of a small power supply. For a Pentium 4 machine, that's almost kind of worrisome. But it's much worth noting that the computer that this power supply came out of was a Pentium 4 machine. In fact, it was a 3 gigahertz Cedar Mill Pentium 4 machine. So you're talking like 115 watt TDP. And this power supply handled that just fine. So it definitely shouldn't have any issue with a 2.4 gigahertz Pentium 4 plus a video card that probably only draws like 30 watts of power, if that. And I guess all else there is to show, the front panel all connected to this motherboard just fine. The power switch, the reset switch, the power and hard drive activity LEDs, they all hooked up just fine. Once again, this is, for as long as I've been doing this, this is the first computer that I've ever built all from scratch. So it was fun to be able to finally do that and, you know, learn how the front panel hooks up. I already knew, but now I was able to actually, you know, do it for myself. And so yeah, it was kind of a cool experience, even if it is a 15-year-old computer platform. I forgot to mention that this case fan was stolen out of a dead power supply, so lots of reuse of old components in this thing. Reuse of a fan from a dead power supply, and a heatsink and fan from other vintage computers, and a power supply from a computer that died. Oh my goodness, what a crazy Frankenstein of a machine this really is. In fact, I've named this computer Frankenstein. That's the network name in Windows, so I think it's a fitting name for something like this. So I've dropped enough of my own hair into the cavity here. Let's go back to my bedroom, set this thing up, and we will demonstrate it. Alright, we're set up on the shelf here. For peripherals, I have my IBM 1024x768 LCD monitor, my Mitsumi PS2 optical mouse, and my Acer Model 6011 AT keyboard connected through an AT to PS2 adapter. Let's fire it up and we'll go into the BIOS first. Turn my light off here. Alright, so here's, it's a AMI BIOS. So this originally had the very first version of the BIOS installed. Yeah, oh, this is a really good story to tell. So this motherboard originally had the first version of the BIOS installed. I've updated it to the latest full stable version. Asus did release another version that they consider a beta version, version 10.12.001 I think. But I just stuck with the latest stable version. From what I've read, there's no added functionality or anything like that with the beta version. Original BIOS version was dated 2004. This is dated at the tail end of 2005. And it's good to do that because, of course, the Pentium 4 spanned a very long time frame from 2000 until like 2006 or 7. So in the case of this motherboard, I think with the original shipping version, it wouldn't have supported the hyper-threading Prescott CPUs, because those came out later in 2004. So I think it's good to have updated the BIOS. But here's the thing. So I found the BIOS ROM file easy enough. It was right from Asus's website, but I couldn't find the BIOS update utility. And I did some reading, and I read that Asus uses their own BIOS update utility called Easy Flash. But I looked and I looked and I looked, and I couldn't find Easy Flash. I couldn't find a download for it. So I asked online. I'm like, where the heck do you get the BIOS update utility? Well, somebody came back to me, and apparently Asus used at least 4 different BIOS update utilities, depending on the type of motherboard or type of computer or whatever that they used, which is just asinine to me. They used 4 different utilities. There was Easy Flash, and Easy Flash itself has 3 different major revisions. There's A-Flash, WinFlash, and then they use the 4th one is a special version of the AMI BIOS DOS update utility. And this is and apparently, like, every motherboard uses a different utility. Apparently this motherboard uses A-Flash. Well, I couldn't find A-Flash. But yeah, that's just asinine to me that Asus would make it so complicated. Why not just have one utility that works with everything and just keep it that way? I don't know. But at the end of the day, I couldn't find whatever Asus utility I was looking for. So I decided to try the generic AMI BIOS DOS utility. I made a DOS startup disk, put the utility on it, put the ROM file on it. I ran the utility. I ran it just in a test mode where it checks to make sure it can read the BIOS chip on the motherboard, and it ran it it read it just fine, no problem. Said it could see the BIOS chip, everything. So I said, all right. I initiated the program, told it to flash the ROM file on the floppy disk to the ROM chip on the motherboard, and it did that. Took a minute or two, and then it said successful. So it was like, great, the BIOS was updated. Well, I went to restart the computer, and when I hit the reset button, a screen comes up, just black screen with white text that says BIOS recovery. And I forget what it said, but basically it said that the BIOS was corrupted. So that generic AMI BIOS update utility that I tried destroyed the BIOS. It supposedly copied it just fine, but it apparently in actuality didn't, and the BIOS was destroyed. Well, thank God this motherboard has an onboard BIOS recovery utility on it, so if the BIOS is corrupted, that utility takes over. And basically what it does is it automatically checks for a floppy disk in the floppy drive, and when it detects a floppy disk, it looks for a particular ROM file on that disk, and when it finds the ROM file, it flashes it, and then you're good to go. And so luckily when that recovery was invoked, it found the ROM file for the updated BIOS on the floppy disk, and it flashed it. And thank God, it didn't kill the motherboard. Everything is fine now. So yeah, I ended up having to accidentally destroy the BIOS in order to update it. The onboard recovery updated the BIOS just fine. So I think it's really asinine that I couldn't find a utility to update the BIOS myself, but I was able to destroy the BIOS, and that's what ended up successfully updating it. So wow, what a cluster. I'm definitely not gonna try and update the BIOS on this motherboard again to the beta version. I am staying right where I'm at. But there's the CPU and RAM data. So here's the BIOS overclock utility. So you can overclock by as much as 30%, which is quite impressive. So for 2.4 gigahertz CPU, 10% of that is 240 megahertz. Multiplied by 3, that's 720 megahertz. So I could get this 2.4 gigahertz Pentium 4 up to 3.12 gigahertz or something like that. That's quite impressive. Onboard hardware monitor, which is quite nice, so you get the temperatures and stuff. And it does vary the speed of the CPU fan. The CPU fan's running at idle right now, and we're idling at 49 degrees Celsius, so it's a Pentium 4, that's for sure. Power supply voltages, 5 volts is good, 12 volts is good enough, and 3.3 volts is horrible, but who cares about 3.3 volts? So yeah, pretty crappy, but once again, it's working just fine. So yeah, there you go. Let's boot into Windows. I have Windows XP installed. As you can see, we booted up fairly quickly. This is a brand new installation. I've installed nothing on this besides Unofficial Service Pack 4. There's the information there. And I named it Frankenstein. Workgroup name is Trent for backwards compatibility. I've got to change that sometime. So yeah, and really that's pretty much about it. If I go into the device manager, give you a look at some of the onboard hardware, but there's the GeForce 3 Ti200 AGP card. There's the onboard Ethernet, oops, Marvell Yukon Gigabit, and SoundMax onboard audio. Let me grab a USB flash drive and I'll show you what happens when I try to plug into this front port. So with a USB analyzer plugged in, I got this for like $5 on eBay. Very useful tool. I got one when I saw that Big Clive uses one. He used to use one just like this, but he uses a different one now. But with it plugged in, you can see 5.12 volts, perfectly fine, so the polarity is correct and everything. But when I plug in my USB flash drive, my flash drive does not light up. And on the desktop, well, I've still got to activate Windows. USB device not recognized. And it draws no current or anything. But if I unplug it, and plug it into a port on the back, it comes right to life, right there. So, I'm gonna guess it's because that repurposed CD audio cable is just not working right. It's carrying power, but it's not able to carry the signal. And so the fact that the computer actually sees that something's plugged in and is able to say that something's not working right tells me that there is a data connection. There is a data connection, but I would say that because of the lack of shielding and stuff that USB data transmission needs, the transmission is just getting corrupted and stuff. So I'll have to get a proper internal USB cable for this. Might steal the one out of this computer just for testing purposes. But yeah, that's pretty much all there is to show. I haven't even had this thing on the internet yet. I haven't installed anything, but it's working just fine. It's running fairly fast. Of course, the problem with Windows XP is once you get all the updates installed and you start installing a web browser and antivirus and stuff, Windows XP bogs down quite a lot, especially on if you're not on an adequately powered computer. Which leaves the question to be, what am I going to use this computer for? I already have a perfectly adequate Windows XP desktop in this machine, which is a dual-core AMD Athlon 64X2 with 2 or 3 gigs of RAM, so this is definitely an adequate XP machine and way more powerful than this. But I don't know, I built this thing not because I have a use for it, but just because it's very nostalgic to me to finally build my dream Pentium 4 computer from my childhood, and also because it's sort of a recreation of the first 2 custom-built computers that I had several years ago. So I built this more for nostalgia than for any usefulness I have for it, but I was thinking I might turn this into a NAS server. I have no way to hook up a NAS server here right now, but maybe in the future when I've got my own place and stuff and a space to put this computer and directly connect it through Ethernet to an internet router, I could use this as a NAS server. house my 1 TB backup RAID array in this computer. Although I'm not sure if the power supply would be able to handle 2 extra hard drives. But yeah, that's one possibility for it. In the future, not right now. As for right now, I guess just enjoy it and play around with it as sort of a bit of nostalgia. Pentium 4 machine. Because I only have 2 Pentium 4 desktops. The other one is my is the IBM NetVista, which is sort of a lowly 1.6 gigahertz Willamette? I'm not even sure it's a Northwood. It might be a Willamette. I never remember, but really early, slow Pentium 4 machine. This is sort of a faster one, especially once you get, once you get a fast, hyper-threading Pentium 4 in there. I'm sort of interested to find out how useful is a desktop Pentium 4. I know a Pentium 4 laptop is absolutely not useful anymore. They are useless for modern use on the internet and stuff. But I've had a couple of people tell me that a later Pentium 4 desktop does have the power to adequately surf the internet, and I think somebody told me they could watch YouTube videos on their Pentium 4 machine. So I'll be really interested when I get the 3.2 gigahertz Pentium 4 on this to get this thing on the internet and see how well it actually does. On that note, I said I didn't know if it was a Northwood or a Prescott in here. Let me get CPU-Z installed, and we'll find out. Alright, I've got CPU-Z installed, and it is a Prescott, non-hyper-threading. And when it comes to the Northwood versus the Prescott, because you could pretty much get all of them in the same speeds, like there's a 3.2 gigahertz Prescott, but there's also a 3.2 gigahertz Northwood. And there's non-hyper-threading and hyper-threading versions of each. And when it comes to Northwood versus Prescott, there really isn't that much of a difference in performance. Prescott should be faster than Northwood, but the problem with Prescott is that it has a very long execution pipeline, which means that there's a lot of latency in the processing compared to Northwood. So I read a website where they compared Northwood and Prescott of the same speed through a bunch of tests, and they, for the most part, were the same. In some tests, Prescott did a little bit better, and in other tests, Northwood did a little bit better. So it's kind of interesting. But the thing with Prescott is you get the SSE3 instruction set. Northwood doesn't have that. So when it comes to running a lot newer software in certain games, I'm sure you want Prescott rather than Northwood. And honestly, that's why I think the Pentium 4 in general is way better than the AMD Athlon XP and Sempron, because those CPUs stopped at SSE. So an AMD Athlon XP or Sempron, they won't run a lot of software, because that software looks for at least SSE2. So that's why I think a Pentium 4 is a lot better in the long run, even though the Athlon XP and the Sempron were faster than the Pentium 4 clock for clock. Well, that's about all there is to show of my new self-built, custom-built Pentium 4 computer. The dream computer of my childhood 10 plus years ago. In a future video, we will try overclocking this computer and see how well it overclocks and how fast we can get it to run stably. But for now, we're going to shut it down and wrap this up. There you go. So this is probably going to be the last video I make before Christmas, in the event that it is. Merry Christmas to those of you who celebrate it, and happy holidays to everyone else. And I will see you in the next video.